All right, before Jeff comes up, I'll just give a brief opening on why we're here today. So my name is John Romine. I'm part of the team at Collaboratory. We've been working with Lee County to facilitate the Recovery Task Force, the Resilient Lee Recovery Task Force for the long-term recovery and resiliency plan. And one of the things that we did as between Collaboratory and Haggerty Consulting, who's the contractor for the county, we met with all of the Recovery Task Force members one-on-one. And when your representative is Counselor Veach, and when we met with Bill and the team, it was clear there's a need from the town's perspective for some funding for some long-term thinking and strategy around the future of Fort Myers Beach. In Collaboratory, we are a regional community foundation, and what I shared with Bill and Andy and Frankie is we do have resources and funds to support that, and we have a partnership with the University of Florida's fiber program to help facilitate that. So that's the sort of context of how we got here. We offered that up as a way that we can support our community and our long-term recovery. And so Jeff's going to paint a little bit of a picture of what they've done across the state after disasters in other communities to do a similar effort. So that is what we are here to share today.
All right, thanks, Sean.
So we're not asking for anything from you. We're actually we're providing something if it's something that is valuable to the town.
Today's a new day.
All right, thank you all very much for having me here. As an architect, I usually have slides. I almost always have pictures to talk to, so I'm going to look at my notes so I stay on some task here. But so yeah, I'm an associate professor in the School of Architecture at the University of Florida and the director of the Florida Institute for Built Environment Resilience, or FIBRE. And we are a collaboration of faculty across the college, design, construction, planning. That is landscape architecture, construction management, interior design, and city and regional planning. That is the core group. We're 6 faculty members, a group of professional research faculty who are also planners, GIS experts, community engagement specialists. And then we also partner with faculty from across the university at large, so geographers and public health professionals and a whole range of people who we work with. And so our fundamental purpose, the purpose of FIBRE, is really around bringing the power of the university through research and needs assessments, through data and resources to communities through a design process, through design and planning processes effectively. And so this conversation is really key to what Jonathan is talking about in terms of us assisting the community, is establishing sort of an introduction to who we are and getting your support for us to work with the city over the course of the next year on a project to assist with the adaptation and the recovery of the community and basically the resilience of the community moving forward. So the process that we've talked about and one of the programs that we've run in other communities through FIBRE. So FIBRE is the overall institute. We also have an organization called the Florida Resilient Cities Program. And what we do with this program is it's really our wing that goes and works with communities on basically 3 things. Their assessment of the issues that they face. So understanding the environments at risk, understanding the environments that are actually safe for future development. Obviously, some of that is clear in the situation that Fort Myers Beach is in now. But looking through data analysis at the sort of the future, the high ground areas, future areas that are going to be strong locations for development moving forward. So that assessment phase, and that's discussing a kind of mapping aspect of that, but that's also including really getting to know the community, do a series of interviews, workshops, understanding the values and aspirations of the community that we're working with. That's kind of phase 1 in our work. Phase 2 is really working with the community stakeholders on potential projects, basically. What we call adaptation action areas, that's a state of Florida word, areas where you would want to transform, looking in relation to issues of sea level rise, storm risk, recovery opportunities. So where's the good place to develop, and how can we start to coalesce resources and visions around those areas? So we would work with the community on a series of design visions where our architects and designers and planners can help kind of bring those ideas to fruition, at least in terms of their kind of preliminary design. And then the third aspect is that we work with communities on the implementation funding for those projects. So you've got an image, you've got a vision, you've got a kind of preliminary plan. How do we move that through the funding mechanisms that are available post-disaster in terms of Resilience Florida, in terms of FEMA long-term mitigation planning? It's a number of avenues to move projects forward. So those are the three aspects of what we do. We're currently working in the city of Cedar Key, which we started about 1.5 years ago. That's an FDEP-funded version of this, where we do the vulnerability assessment, we move towards the adaptation plan. Same project in the city of Port St. Joe. We've been working there since 2019, actually. We work in Jacksonville, and now we're looking forward to working here in Fort Myers Beach. And that's the overview of the process that we see moving forward. This would be, I could get into the details of a schedule, looking at that sort of 3 phases, more or less. The first phase is an assessment phase, which would have a workshop over the next 5 months. The second phase would be the design engagement phase in the spring of next year, coming into the summer and fall, when we'd really start working on implementation funding and opportunities to see those projects forward. So that's the basic idea of what we're proposing, and so I think I'd open it up for questions.
I just had a quick question. First of all, good morning. Thank you for being here. Thank you for making the drive.
Sure.
You use the term implementation of funding. I'm sure that's a very carefully chosen term. Does that also include the acquisition of funds? In other words, by working with a group like yours, does it enhance our ability to receive grants and funding from other state and federal entities?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm talking about. For instance, the FDEP vulnerability assessment, the FDEP's funding for the Resilient Florida program requires a state-approved vulnerability assessment to get funding. So there are hundreds of millions of dollars that they're putting out through that program. As of this year, you have to have a state-approved vulnerability assessment to receive those funds. So we've worked with our other communities to achieve that level. And I don't know exactly what the status of the Fort Myers Beach vulnerability assessment is right now. My understanding is you're under the umbrella of Lee County, or within the sort of the overarching Fort Myers vulnerability assessment. So my understanding is you have an approved FDEP plan, but that might have changed at this point. So we could work to update that and to look at specific issues of where that vulnerability assessment is accurate, or where things didn't happen the way they were anticipated. So that right there, having that approved FDEP plan, opens you up to a range of funding opportunities through Resilient Florida. That's one avenue. I think that the long-term recovery through Resilient Lee and through HUD is another way that what we design can align with those projects and put you in good position to advocate for that. So whatever that project, that might be transportation related, it might be housing related, it might be commercial development related. As long as it aligns with what HUD is looking for, what Resilient Florida is looking for, then you're in a really good position to go after those funds.
Is the implementation, your term, of funding, is that based upon the work product that you're going to put forth, or is it based upon, and it may be a combination of both, your reputation in the state of Florida? In other words, these funding sources, if they see that we're working with a group like yours, do you have a reputation as such where that has a tendency to draw funding in because people see that we're serious because we're working with a group like yours, and are there other groups like yours out there?
There are, yeah. I'd like to think that there's some reputation that people notice. I mean, we do have funding from the state of Florida, so FDEP knows who we are. We're working on 2 projects for them. We do have previous projects with FEMA and other national funders, so we're known. I would say more importantly, though, when you go up for Resilient Florida grants or FEMA long-term mitigation grants or the potential of a BRIC grant, which is Building Resilience and Infrastructure in Communities, I think is what that is. It's there. FEMA's basically pre-disaster mitigation funds. Is that you have already demonstrated community input. You've demonstrated some level of community buy-in on a project. The project has been weighed in terms of affordability. It's been weighed against future climate risks. So your project is teed up in a way that you're ready for those funds. And that is what I think we bring to the table. So, I mean, hopefully we have a good reputation. You can ask other people around that. But I think what that really means on the ground is that we understand what those funders are looking for. And they're all looking for something slightly different. And so we can assist with the actual development of proposals to sort of tee you up for those funds. And I honestly, I mean, as an architect, I think that a picture's worth a lot. And so if you're talking about a redevelopment of an area and it's just words, that means one thing. But if you have a process, you say, look, this is just a preliminary concept. We ran a workshop around it with the community. The community has demonstrated buy-in to that. I think that goes a long way.
Thank you.
So do you work, like, for districts, say, like our downtown district? Do you work specifically on districts, or do you look at it as an island as a whole, or kind of whatever the town would be looking at? Kind of walk me through how that would work. Say that we decide we want to work with you guys.
Yeah.
And how does that work as far as community involvement? What are the steps? I guess the first steps. You said you have a kind of a schedule to go through, but.
Yeah, and that's fairly open-ended. I mean, I think that if this was funded through FDEP, we would have had to write a very specific proposal of exactly what we were going to do. This is still fairly open-ended, so we're here to work with the town. That could mean the whole island. I think that the vulnerability assessment would be island-wide. The data is that scale, so we would look at the whole scale. But we could choose through your guidance and community input whether we wanted to focus on a series of architectural or block or neighborhood scale projects. We could think about things that are more policy-based, more of a land use scale. So that's kind of up to how we move forward with the process. To me, that first assessment phase would nail those things down over the next couple of months.
Bill, I know that you've spoken with them, and what was your vision of having them come? I mean, what is it that you saw long term?
Well, I was looking at an island-wide thing, but really everything is segmented. So, what works, you're coming up with a plan for Old San Carlos, Times Square, some vision that we can do. And, the idea is not just what we want or the stakeholders, but also where is the funding available? What do we have to do to get funding to really realize some aspects? But I kind of pointed out, I drove around the island, I pointed out like 3 or 4 things that I thought we could use help. One is kind of envisioning, and I said this before, is that with the storm, we're being encouraged to essentially move commercial inland. And depending on what happens with Times Square, my feeling is that a lot of the commercial aspects of that area are going to move down Old San Carlos, move inland. So it's good to have a plan in place of what that will look like, what that street could look like, and so much of it's being redeveloped. So that was one aspect of it. The other, and that's generally encompassing the downtown, including Times Square. The other, we talked about our commercial districts and what we can do. We're in an enviable position now because, especially the commercial boulevard, is extremely strict zoning. So it means whatever we do is going to be permissive. And if it's more permissive, it means we don't have a problem with the state. But again, what we do, if these guys in both, one thing that I really felt is I think people, and me including, respond to the drawings. developers do that. They'll get somebody, they'll come up with a sketch saying, this is what we're looking at. It's hard just with words to try to really get people to understand what it is any of these proposals mean. So and I really, the other thing is I really like the idea of public engagement. I really want to see that. I think the public is anxious to have a say in our future, and I'd like to do that as openly and as quickly as possible. So, long answer to a short question, but I think that there's lots of aspects, but I think a lot of it is intentionally still up in the air. I think the idea is we engage with somebody like this, and then there's a lot of back and forth, and it's what the council wants them to prioritize going forward is where they get direction.
Well, just so I'm clear, so if you were to take us on as a project, are you already funded, or would there be some obligation from the town to fund you in some capacity?
The collaboratory is funding us for this work, so no, there's no obligation for funding. I mean, the only obligation that I see, and it's not an obligation, but your support and participation. You know, I think that's really important because otherwise it becomes a little bit of an here we are. But getting town council to participate in workshops and to really, be the kind of champions behind a project is really important to the success.
And I just yield to our town manager. It sounds like there has been some discussions of either with the county, the state, or the feds to bring in a planner of sorts. Would that conflict with what we're talking about this morning, or would that be a good marriage, or where are we with sort of those broader strategies?
Well, I've had a couple of conversations with another group that I'd been familiar with, and then Councilor Veets brought fiber into the picture, and so this is something that we as a town need to do, whether it's this group or another group, and work in collaboration with the county and try to discover exactly how we want to move forward and identify areas of need and want. And so, this is something that was talked about even before I got here. Not necessarily this group, but this type of practice.
I guess that's helpful. I guess I would also be curious, is it something that both groups could participate in? In other words, is it a big enough project where you could segment it, or does it make sense to only have one entity? I'm just thinking out loud, I'm just asking. I really don't know the answer to the question. I'm just trying to draw you out.
I actually think it is big enough for more than one. One could do it, but I think that would be an option that we need to explore and see if that's how the wishes of the council, which direction they'd like to go. All the eggs in one basket, or kind of commercial versus the residential and multifamily areas, and go from there.
And I'll add, we're an academic organization, so in terms of partnering with professionals, I think that's a very good thing for us to consider. So I'd be very much open to that.
Any other questions for Jeffrey?
Well, let's just say I really do appreciate you coming down, and I would like to know more about some of the other groups, and of course what the funding obligations in the town would be with them.
Right.
But I'm impressed with the horsepower you guys bring, because you have, your academics. You're up to the, you always keep fresh on what the current trends are and what's important, and the multidisciplinary thing, because I think it's kind of hard to find a group that has engineers and architects and planners and people who can do the social engagement effectively. Because we've seen both very effective social engagement and some that's not so much. Right. So I do appreciate coming down here. I think that if we want to go forward, I think if there are other options, I think I certainly would like to bring those to the table. But I would like to move on this fairly quickly, because I feel like it's been a year and we're still, starting at the starting gate.
Mm-hmm.
Just before you, I'm sorry,
Sure.
before you sit down, do you have I know you probably do both, but do you have a particular focus, commercial versus residential? In other words, do you have more expertise in one than the other?
No. I would say no, because we draw from a pretty large expertise, for sure. So in a lot of our work, that's the process that we take on, which is that it's fairly open at the beginning, meaning we don't know whether you're going to bring residential or commercial to us, and frankly, I think much of what you have is a kind of a blending of those anyway. And so we see what comes out of the process, and then we bring on the appropriate people as we move
So
forward.
you're an architect yourself?
I'm an architect and a city planner by training.
So as you took the tour of the island, was there something that just made you salivate and that said, I'd like to dig into this particular aspect of the project?
Well, yeah, I mean, the Times Square area, I mean, there was a couple projects, there areas that we looked at. I think that the places where the city has a stake, has ownership of land, I think some of the areas that are, totally privately owned, the actual impact could be, it's fairly limited, right? I mean, if it's owned by a developer and they're going to do something, then we can shape land use codes. But in terms of providing a really, a kind of an exemplar vision of a community, I do think those two areas of where the city hall is and Times Square are really quite interesting because, particularly, let's say Times Square. I mean, it's a commercial district. You don't want to give that up, right? You don't want to lose that area, and I can't blame the community for not wanting to say, oh, gee, it flooded. We should move it back. And I would say there are ways to design that in a way that allows it to be there and allows it to be extremely successful, but also makes sure that it's resilient. So for me, as someone who deals with resilience, is how do you design that in a way that is truly not only resilient for today and tomorrow, but resilient for the next 30, 40, 50 years. So for me, that's really interesting. The transportation connectivity at that particular junction is kind of a wicked problem. There's a lot of moving parts there, so I find that pretty interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
So question, I mean, obviously you're associated with Florida, but in coastal communities that you've worked with before, do you have, I'm the visual person here, so
Yeah.
do you have examples of before, during, and after that we could look at to see what you were totally involved in, the style, all that kind of thing?
Sure. I mean, we have a website, and I can send you the link to that and some of
That'd
our
be
current
great.
projects
That'd
that
be
we can
great.
share with you, certainly.
Well, we certainly appreciate you coming out, and we, as you said, Bill, this is something that's very important that has to get moving forward fairly quickly. But we got to make sure we're doing it with the right people. That,
Sure.
we've got, it's not just us, it's the county that we're working with as well as the landowners. So, you said something there that really kind of struck me that, the town has to have some sort of interest into the area. And I'm trying to think as you're saying that, other than Times Square, where the town really has any interest in the land around the area. So other than, Town Hall and Times Square, there's not a ton that I can think of, but it's something to think about.
Yeah.
And it sounds like you guys work with the county already, obviously with the collaboratory, so that answers my question there. But if you could send us that link so we could kind of
Sure.
take a look at what you did. I'm visual like Counselor Woodson. It's nice to see what you talked about, what you implemented, and what came out of it.
Sure.
And one thing I did mention to them, because, I mean, with our CB zoning district, and I've been talking about this district for a while, right now we're very, very restrictive on it. And we basically froze the intensity and froze the density on when the town was incorporated and haven't changed it since. But that also makes us in an enviable position. It means that anything we do is more permissive, and that then will not run afoul with the state. So one thing we talked about, and this is something I've mentioned before, is just coming up, even though maybe there's commercial property that we don't own, but we have we can do some planning work towards it, also to come up with ideas, templates, if you will,
Yeah.
that are within our rules, that are pre-approved. So if you have a small landowner who's still holding on after a year, that it's a way for them to be able to rebuild without having to go through planners and attorneys and variances and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, that's, as you probably are well aware, we're working with our staff, and we've got an outside firm that's working on a lot of this. So I want to be sure that we're not duplicating benefits here.
Right.
We're not.
Right.
You're not doing something that we're already working on. If you can singularly focus on certain things, since we already have our staff working with someone that we've already hired
Right.
to do some of the things that you're talking about, Bill, I want to make sure that we're not doing things twice or overwriting something that
Sure.
somebody's already put 2 years of effort in to try to get us across the finish line. So.
And I know we are working on planning aspects, certainly at a higher level, but not to the granular level of, I mean, I look at the kind of the templates as a suggestion to people. It's not saying you must build this, it's saying if you want to get the most out of your land and want to get there quickly, this is a way to do it, to expedite the process. This is where some of the, what do they call lean urbanism
Yeah.
and the pink zones come into place. It's just allowing the small landowners to get a leg up on it. The other thing is people like we're working with Tidal Basin on funding. I'm sure that they know how to work with that kind of people, and maybe they know some funding that Tidal Basin doesn't, because not everybody knows everything. But the other thing that's kind of important too is that, like, I know there's some disappointment that there wasn't an economic revitalization aspect to the Resilient Lee. And the last Resilient Lee meeting, they're basically saying, well, that's kind of a multidisciplinary thing. So maybe with economic revitalization, you need infrastructure, you need planning, you need X, Y, Z. So it's not necessarily an item. But if you get somebody who knows both how to fund something and what can be funded, then that can also influence what we're proposing on these things.
And I would add one more element to this, is that we work with students, so we have professional staff and we are professionals, but a lot of the work is students, and we can tie that in a meaningful way, which is that they're really able to explore to an extent that you can't. A consultant, this would be a lot of consulting work, right? So I think that investigating a series of templates for potential home developments, that's the kind of thing that students can really thrive on and take on and push forward, and provides a lot of information for the city to consider. I think that's really important. And it shouldn't conflict, I think that there's ways to set it up so it doesn't conflict with the ongoing, more professional or government aligned work.
So would it even be possible to, like, if one of these landowners came forward and wanted help to put them in touch with a student to try to do something kind of custom for what they're looking at, what their parcel is and what their goals are?
It's possible. I mean, there is the question at some point of, like, kind of students doing free labor for someone who could have hired an architect, so we have to be careful of that. But I do think that if it's a community benefit that provides service to the community, that is not just for one or two or three people, but is actually a kind of a broader benefit, then absolutely. I mean, one case in point is that we were developing housing in a manufactured house. This is not what you'd be seeing here, is much denser. But we were working with the city of Port St. Joe, and we worked with 6 homeowners or landowners in the community of North Port St. Joe. It's a very poor area. And so we worked very directly with 6 landowners to develop this manufactured house. Now, the house is still in the process of being funded through, it's a manufactured house, so it has a lot of factory requirements. But the point is that we were working with 6 people for the benefit of potentially hundreds. So I think that was a real important takeaway.
All right. Well, thank you, Jeffrey.
Great.
It's been
Okay.
very informative.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I will make a comment on Jeff, that he was, when he was here last time, that was when Adelia was coming. And he
Yeah,
was,
I remember that.
he was very, very patiently, going on a drive around, looking at all these neighborhoods, that this big shelf cloud was coming down, and he had a, 4-hour drive ahead of him.
I made it before the cloud consumed us, but thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Next is item B, amendments to the floodplain ordinance regulating coastal A zones like V zones for residential structures. Who's taking?
Kristen will.
All right.
Good morning, everyone. We're trying to update our floodplain ordinance to comply with the,
Kristen, you may want to identify yourself
Oh.
and your position.
sorry, Kristen Schumacher, Town of Fort Myers Beach floodplain coordinator. Like I said, I'm working on the floodplain ordinance, and we need to update it to include the coastal A zones because of the map changes on November 17, 2022. We are looking to regulate coastal A zones like V zones for residential structures. In the Florida Building Code, they generally are regulated similarly. The difference is that they allow backfilled stem walls for coastal A zones for the residential structures. And we are looking to remove it as a higher standard for CRS to make the town more resilient. we want to protect our citizens, so
Kristen, I'm gonna have you take it up 10,000 feet for the first 2 minutes for those who might be watching from home. Talk a little bit about the difference between an A and a V zone, and then let's start defining those acronyms a little bit so anybody who might be watching has a better sense of what we're talking about.
Okay, so November, our flood maps changed. We now have a Limois line, which is a limited moderate wave action. The studies show that between a V zone, high hazard zone, and an A zone, which we're all A and V zones on the island, the waves don't stop once it hits the A zone. The waves come up and then slowly go down. So the coastal A zone, the Limois line, was put there because they determined that there's about anything seaward, about 1.5 to 3 foot of wave action going in. So it's kind of more like a V zone, but not as high velocity. Is that
That's helpful, thank you.
okay? So
And this coastal A zone did not exist before the November flood map revision, right?
correct. This is new to Florida, the coastal A zone.
And you said that we're all either in a V or A zone, so A goes all the way from the V zone at the beach on the Gulf side all the way through to the Bay side.
The V zone is all along the beach, and then with the flood map changes, it kind of wraps around the island like this.
Okay.
Then it used to be maybe a house or two in from the bay side of Estero. Now they changed it with the Limois line. They did coastal A zone, and it runs similar to where the V zone used to be, but it depended on their flood study. So it wraps around the island, affecting some properties that were A zones, and now they're part of the coastal A zone. I couldn't upload a map into the thing because the files were too big from the FEMA website. If anybody listening would like to see them, it's the FEMA Map Service Center. You can view them online.
So now with the coastal A zone, so
Hold on, Bill. Where would they find it online, Kristen, if they
The
wanted to look at
FEMA Map Service Center.
And how would they find that?
We're trying to get one put up now.
Okay, very good.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah. Sorry, Bill.
So my understanding is that with coastal A, that takes out some that used to be V zone and some that used to be A zone, but mostly A, right?
Yeah,
And I think that FEMA recommends that we treat the coastal A zone like the V zone. And you mentioned the stem wall, but there's other things you can do in coastal A that you can't do in the V zone, right? Like
Wet proposing.
yeah, wet building and dry building. I don't know what the difference between those two things.
we're talking about residential only
Yeah.
for
Okay.
our flood ordinance. We're allowing the dry flood proofing for commercial or non-residential structures, that everything remains the same what is allowed. Our only higher standard is for the residential structures.
Okay, so this is about the structural. It's not about the use at all because
No.
still you're not A or V. It doesn't matter. You're really not allowed to do much under flood anyway, right?
Yeah. Correct. A zones per Florida Building Code are, like I said, regulated like the V zones, except for the backfilled stem walls. The-
So you went through and you looked at the difference between what can be done in V zone in the coastal A and the A, and you said that the one thing are these backfilled stem wells.
Yes, the one thing is the backfilled stem walls that are allowed per Florida Building Code.
And those are basically like a cinder block wall that they fill in with dirt
Correct.
to raise up the foundation of the house.
Correct.
And so what the alternative is to do it on pilings, right?
Correct.
And Kristen, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think when you briefed me earlier on this just is for folks who are building new, correct? This impacts.
This is new or substantially improved.
Define substantially. improved.
Substantially improved is when you go over the 50% rule
Yep.
in restoring your home to pre-disaster condition, or just in general remodeling.
So if we adopt these changes that you're recommending, if somebody had already made application to the town prior to our adoption of the revision based upon your recommendation, are they grandfathered in, or do they have to go back and change their plans? How does it work for somebody who's already begun the process?
Once a permit is submitted, they stay with those standards. If the day, say, tomorrow you adopt it, just hypothetical, any permits already in through today will be in these regulations. Anything on the day of adoption and forward, they will have to adhere to the new regulations.
Does the building community know this is coming? In other words, are they preparing their clients for such an event?
This is why we brought it to the MMP meeting to discuss for public outreach and to see which direction is likely that we'd like to go through. So I believe we'd like to get this adopted by the end of this year. So if this is something favorable that we're really looking into, we're going to start letting designers know and building.
Is the word out there, though? In other words, do they know
It is
that this
now.
is coming and this is imminent?
It is now.
It is now.
But
Yeah.
it hasn't been widely disseminated through the community, the building community. In other words, this will be this will be news to them, I guess is my question.
Somewhat. People who ask me, I let them know that we're considering this, but I haven't broadcast it out like as a public broadcast yet.
Okay, just trying to understand where we're at. Thank you.
And, go ahead. You're gonna
No,
say-
I was just gonna, so in my neighborhood, for example, I mean, this is a big change, and people who had already started the permitting process, the difference in the cost of doing this is, in a couple of cases, $100,000 of doing the different pilings versus the stem wall, backfill stem wall, all that kind of thing to go up. So, I mean, it's substantial to an individual resident of making this change.
It also helps with their flood insurance premiums.
It may.
Now,
I'm sorry.
well, I'm just going to say, because one question to me is these stem walls, and I understand these are probably very useful if you just need to get up a few feet. But in most of our places in the A zone, you've got to be way up in space. You're not going to make a stem wall and fill it with dirt. And then
For that height.
for that height.
Yeah,
I mean, so the question is, how many of these stem walls do you see come across your desk in an application?
Honestly, I've seen from when I've been doing the reviews, they're generally all piers, pilings, and posts. So people are building
Going up anyway.
anyhow. They are trying to protect their structures.
Right. And it doesn't, and it's still looser and easier than a proper V zone, right? Because the foundations in V zones, I know there's certain criteria that are different. Like, will it have to have the concrete, beam to sit on, or will it be?
The lowest horizontal structural member where we measure to, is that what?
Well, I know that in the V zone, that lowest horizontal member's got to be reinforced concrete. In an A zone, it can be wood, placed on pilings, right? I'm just wondering, are there any other costs of construction concerns going from an A zone to a coastal A besides the stem wall?
Can I have Steve come up to talk about building costs and Florida Building Code?
Good morning, Steve Poposky, town engineer. So the building, it will generally cost more to do pilings. I'm not going to say it won't. It generally does. It doesn't have to, but it certainly usually does. You don't need to have a concrete beam, if that was the comment. It just needs to be designed and elevated, and so you could have wood. It depends on the design. Was that the question?
Well, the height you have to go to is the height you have to go to. It doesn't matter how you get to that height.
Right, yeah, it has to be designed, licensed, designer, engineer, architect kind of thing. It will cost more on the front end. I think that's pretty clear that that's the sort of the market forces, I think. It depends, everything depends. But you should probably expect it to cost a little bit more because you are elevating. It's a little bit a different deal. But it will save on flood insurance quite a bit. So it could potentially pay for itself over time. It depends on how long you're going to be in the property, I think. You know, if you're going to be there for just a couple of years, I don't think you're going to get a payback.
Well, I'll tell you, I've got a few concerns with this, and I'll tell you why. I think what we've tried to accomplish this entire time is to allow our residents options. We did it with the cottage lots, we did it with other decisions that have been made, and I think this takes away an option to a potential resident. And I'm also concerned, would this be construed through Senate Bill 250 as being more restrictive than what we had pre-storm?
That is a serious problem. If it's more burdensome or more, that is a serious problem. If it's more restrictive or more burdensome, you can't do it until the middle of next year.
That was my biggest concern when I read this. Was I don't know that we can legally even do this.
Well, I thought there were certain exceptions in building up to, you know, when there's different code changes or resiliency. I thought there were certain exceptions to that in 250.
No, no, not if you are within 100 miles of the landfall of either Hurricane Ian or Nicole. I mean,
I don't
it's
think
pretty
we were 100
blanket.
miles from it.
Yeah.
I don't think we were 100 miles. I think we were dead on.
I think you were. I think you were.
Steve, just since you're our town engineer, could you, in layman's terms, I mean, I think people understand what a piling, you know, putting a home on pilings. Could you just explain, just in lay terms, what using a stem wall as opposed to the pilings? Just sort of what are we talking about?
Yeah, those are foundation types. So if you go to a lot of towns that are sort of away from the coast a little bit, you'll see slab on grade, which is just a concrete slab poured on the ground over a footer, like a turned down little, like a footer into the ground. A stem wall is you build a wall just above that footer. Instead of pouring your slab on the ground, you basically elevate the slab a few feet typically. So you're going to put a stem wall, and then you're going to fill it with dirt and compact it, and then you're going to pour the concrete on top, so that the slab's going to be up a few feet off the ground. That's a stem wall.
And that's done because why? How does that help?
Elevation. It costs less. It costs less over time, and plus it's typically a requirement for the elevation of the house. The lowest floor has to be, say, in an A zone, the top of the lowest, they call it lowest floor, has to be at or above that flood protection level, the base flood elevation plus a foot by building code.
Thank
So
you.
that's the point. That's the intent, is to try to save people's property, you know, money over time. And I think the intent of the Florida Building Code and the federal regulations is to elevate these houses over time. Now, how fast that happens has to do with the codes. But we do have pretty strict codes in Florida. Nationwide, we're considered one of the strictest. Maybe California is right up there too. So statewide, we're pretty strict. We need to be pretty aware of it, as just after experiencing a hurricane, we should, you know, possibly consider some, but the speed at which that happens is sometimes set by other rules as well.
You know, besides this not being able to fit within the rules of the Senate Bill 250, I'm concerned with how many people we don't know are in the process. There, as you guys well know, there were a couple of homeowners that were caught flat-footed when FEMA changed the flood maps, and they were in the design phase of their house. They hadn't gone to application yet, but they were in the design phase of their house, and because the FEMA maps changed, they had to redesign their entire house at the cost of tens of thousands of dollars. So I think this could, we don't, the unknown, for me, along with the more restrictiveness of the Senate Bill 250, I don't know that this is the right time to do that, personally.
Yeah, you could build a stem wall that's really tall. You know, you could. It's not typically done. Normally, you'd want the storage area below, and you'd kind of build pilings, and it's probably cheaper. But you get to a certain point, and it's just going to be cheaper to go to pilings. But again, it's just an idea, and we think about our CRS rating, but they also think about people that are in the process of rebuilding. What options do they have? And I guess that's why we're bringing it.
Well, and I think, Christian, I think you said that, you haven't seen any really come through yet. And I think people are going the more resilient route just for that reason. So, but there may be one or two that are in the process now that we don't know that could be using these stem walls. And I'd really hate for them to have to start redesigning all over again because they just haven't made it to the permit application yet.
Yeah, I think that's what she was trying to say before, was that if you've already applied for a permit, I would say the word grandfather, but you're already in the process, so you don't have to switch to the new regulation if it's adopted later.
No, yeah, I get that,
So,
but it's
yeah.
the ones that
It's the
haven't done.
design part.
But if they're in design and they're like,
Yeah, they've
oh,
got their
next week we
blueprints,
adopt
they-
something,
yeah.
and then
Yeah.
and if for the first time they come in, I want to build a house, they would be under the new regs, yeah.
Okay, could I make a comment? I just brought up 250. And if this is something which is not optional at all, if it's a new restriction, and it actually is more restrictive or burdensome, doesn't matter if it's for resiliency's sake or anything else. If it's to comply with the FEMA requirement, but it's my understanding that this is not required by FEMA, okay, then we can't do it until October of next year.
Well, that solves that.
That was an easy decision.
Well, it certainly gives us a timeline, and we could look at it at that time and see if we still believe that this is the course that we want to go. But I can see that would prevent us from adopting something right now.
Right, but at least it'll give people who may be thinking about entering into design that want to use a stem wall, that this could be coming in a year from now, and adjust your planning accordingly.
But
Or at least consider it,
Right.
it's a design consideration that you may want to look at. You may not have thought about pilings or columns, but it's kind of a nice system because you are sort of high and dry when it comes to a flood. There's elevators and stairs and so forth, but there's a lot of storage underneath. A lot of jurisdictions, they build typically on slabs, and haven't really thought about building on pilings because nobody around them is on them. But when they look at it, they see the storage underneath, and they can park all their, recreational items and whatnot. So there's definitely some advantages to it.
Well, all you have to do is drive around and see what made it through the storm and what didn't. It should make your decision pretty easy.
What we could do, if we want to give people more opportunities, if we can, as long as it's not mandatory that they do this, we can give them more opportunities. In other words, if this is something that, and I'm furthest thing in the world from an architect or an engineer, but if this is just an option that we are opening up for people, but they can still do what otherwise would be allowed, then there's nothing wrong with us giving people, because it's not more restrictive or more burdensome, because it's not required.
But I don't think that's what this is not doing that. This would be
Yeah, this is
more
just
restrictive.
suggesting or talking about a potential higher standard or requirement. So this would be a requirement, but we would have to put that off. We always, we do typically kind of talk about it. If people ask, we'll tell them some of the positives and negatives of building in that way. But as you can see, everyone on the beach and the V zone has to build that way. Coastal A they're starting to move. That's sort of the trend, is they're moving this line further away from the coast, and they're starting to change the zones. So Coastal A is, over time, that's probably what will happen, is they're trying to move these buildings up in the air.
So basically, people would have an option for the next year. I mean, we could educate them as to the difference. They don't have to do it, because we really can't make a decision or enforce it until October of '24, correct? So it'd be an education process, and they at least have choices. They can decide what they want to do, but we can revisit it again like next September or something.
And I'm fully in favor of your recommendation. I think it makes sense from the resiliency standpoint. But now that people know they have a year, maybe we can start letting them know next October this is going to be the new building standard. Because I think when this comes back next October, I don't want to speak for you guys sitting here, but it sounds like everybody's kind of thinking this is a good thing when we can do it.
Yeah, something they might want to consider also, just from a financial standpoint, is the cost will probably be higher. They have to shop around for sure, but there's a possibility that insurance will charge more in the future when they if they become non-compliant. So if they built under a stem wall, and now, I don't know, 5 years from now, they change the rules again, and now everything has to be on pilings, the insurance company would charge you more for flood insurance because you have a non-compliant structure, even though, you had no idea at the time.
That it was changing, right?
Oh, yeah, and I think, so it seems like the two conclusions I get from it, one is that it's probably a technique that, practically speaking, no one's going to use, because it goes in the coastal A zone, you're probably 10-foot flood at a minimum, so you'd probably take a 5-6 foot stem wall, which would be a lot of effort. And the stem wall is going to, the flow is going to go around the stem wall, which means it's going to cause some scouring more than other techniques. But since we can't do it anyway, it's not going to really affect anybody, and we can't do anything for a year, so we might as well just table this until we can.
All right. Thanks, guys.
You bet.
The next item for discussion is item C, section 34-3238, post-disaster build-back policy discussion. Sarah?
Good morning, Sarah Prost with Community Development. I was asked to bring a discussion item to you today about post-disaster build-back. That is section 34-3238 of the Land Development Code. Currently, the town has many structures that are over density, so they're non-conforming for density. For rebuilding those units, the property owner has the option to decrease the number of units to match what our current future land use districts allow, or they have the option to build back by the post-disaster build-back regulations.
Sarah, I always like to start up a little bit. Why would that have occurred? Why do we have so many folks that have all this additional density?
So when the town adopted its future land use maps, it's unclear if they did sort of a survey of what the properties currently had in them. It appears that it may have been based on sort of an ideal density for the areas rather than ground truthing what the density was in those neighborhoods. So we find that in some of the neighborhoods that were primarily single family, there were also duplexes and triplexes and even quadplexes that weren't really accounted for. So if you just looked at the number of structures, that density was pretty close. In some places, still it was over density, but when you look at the number of units that existed within those structures, they ended up being over density.
This happened years ago when
Yes.
we incorporated? Or?
Yes, that was when we incorporated and adopted our first comprehensive plan and future land use map.
Thank you.
Is that the birthplace of legal nonconforming?
For this instance, most likely. It's hard for us to nail down some of the dates, and I know that Jason Smalley spoke to you guys previously about how we determine if these units were previously existing or not. So you know that there are some issues with record keeping, and it may not be clear when these units were created, but we do have evidence that they existed, and it appears that most of them existed prior to the town's incorporation. So right now, the option that they have to build back if they want to keep the number of units, so keeping the number of units is the big carrot. You know, those units have value. However, a lot of the units were very, very small. They provided a bedroom, a bath, maybe a small kitchen. Some of them are as small as 400 square units or 400 square feet, or even smaller than that. So they are small units, and as people are looking to build back, the post-disaster build back only allows them to build back the square footage that they had. So they have to base it on the data that they have available, which is sometimes they have building plans and sometimes they're relying on the LEAP property appraiser information, and they can build back that square footage. What we're finding is that these small square footages are difficult for people to build back, and in many instances, it doesn't make a lot of financial sense to build them back so small because they are elevated. Again, the unit itself has a lot of value, so they don't want to get rid of them, but they're trying to figure out how to build them back in a way that makes financial sense for them. So I was asked to bring forward some suggestions on how we might look at this code, modify this code. Right now, it is also included in the comprehensive plan. So this would require a change to the comprehensive plan as well as the land development code. But as you know, we're in the process of updating the comprehensive plan right now. So if you were interested in making any changes, we could incorporate that into both the comprehensive plan and the future land use, the comprehensive plan and the land development code.
Sarah, I don't want to interrupt you, but I just, when you said they have to build it back at that same square footage, aren't they allowed some additional space for ADA requirements like bathrooms and hallways and stuff? Is there?
The way it's written, that actually says for commercial resident. So the way it's written in the code, it sounds as if that was intended for hotel motel density, which we're trying to not include as density going forward. That's been a big part of our discussion. So we have provided some allowances in talking with people trying to figure out how they can develop these, and said, for shared hallways, for making, when there was a very, very small bathroom, okay, we do want those to be ADA accessible. We don't want to disallow anybody from living in these units just because the bathroom is too small for a wheelchair to turn around in. So we have been providing some allowance, although the code's not particularly clear on how that's supposed to apply. And that's also one of the problems moving forward. How much additional square footage does that give you? And, everybody's playing with the numbers, trying to figure out how to get a few extra square feet, when in reality, they're not getting enough to develop anything substantial anyway. So it looks like you were about to ask something, Bill. I apologize.
Well, no, that's okay. You finished with your thoughts.
Okay.
For Jim, if you're done with that.
Yes.
Well, there's a couple aspects to this that I think are really important. One is these small ADUs. They were an important part of our housing picture before, and being small also means that they may make less economic sense to the guy who's going to rebuild it, but they fill an important niche in our housing market for people. Because smaller also tends to be a little cheaper. The other thing is, I know we got into this bit before. There hasn't been the greatest record keeping. We had the time when the town was formed, where we said everything that was in place before that is legal. But then, when I first moved here, the word was out that you closed the downstairs, you did the inspection, and then later you had your contractor come in and finish space. And a lot of people did that, but then a lot of people sold that. So people who bought thinking that their place was legal, but it wasn't, and then really not having a good way of documentation trail to figure out whether it is or not. That's when we talked about that in council before and gave direction to staff to say, tie goes to the homeowner if they have, a reasonable amount of evidence that it existed before then. So
Bill, you used the term ADU. What does that stand for?
accessory dwelling unit,
All right, thank you.
which would all these are considered accessory dwelling units, right?
Some of them actually are considered to, they should be accessory dwelling units by the way our code is written, but a lot of these are called things like duplexes and triplexes. And because they were in existence prior to the code, they don't necessarily meet the requirements within our code for an ADU. So the way our code sort of awards accessory dwelling units, it has some specific criteria about, how they're counted and when they're counted and, how they're considered legal. And not all of these fall under that because of the record keeping issue. And when the storm came and then people came to us and said, well, this was a triplex and it says it on LIPA and I can give you evidence, then we had to accept those, and they didn't necessarily fall into the criteria that we would consider them an ADU by our code. So they are conceptually an ADU. They may not specifically fit into that niche in our code.
Yeah, this is one of those things, I know you and I have talked a lot about this, Sarah. This is one of those things that I've really struggled with. If someone had a triplex before the storm, but now because of the way the code is written, they can't get back what they had, it makes me think that, and I know this for a fact, I've spoken to several residents, that had some of these duplexes or triplexes in a residential multifamily zoning district that would have taken the house down and built back a more resilient house, but the code was restrictive to not allow them back what they had before,
That's not true.
well,
The code did allow it through the pre-disaster build back, and because we were trying to encourage that, but the code didn't provide enough carrots. I mean, it's essentially the same as the post-disaster build back, except you have to go through the CPD, or rather RPD process. So it didn't provide enough incentive for people to go through that process in advance of the storm.
and I'm, as I've said before, I think what we've tried to do is allow people at least back what they had before the storm. And if they can provide that they had a duplex or a triplex, I don't really see that as increasing density because it was there before. It's not, they're not adding another unit. They don't get to add a fourth unit or a third unit if they had two, but they're getting back what they had. Now, I'm open to listening to putting a cap on it, because if they were to tear a house down, as you and I have spoke, if they were to tear down a triplex and build a single-family home there, they could build a very large home on these lots. At the end of the day, as a community and as a council, do we care if there's 3 units in that box or if there's 1? Because they had 3 before. Again, we're not talking about giving someone that had a single-family home multifamily units. We're talking about replacing what was there. But I'd certainly be open to, I don't want to say put a cap, but if you had 1,000 feet, you can double it, or
So would you like me to provide you a few suggestions that I have regarding
Please.
how this could be handled?
Please do.
Okay, so one concept is many of these structures had what we would consider accessory dwelling units on the ground floor. Obviously, those cannot be built back. Sometimes there was parking provided within that area, sometimes not. One option would be that the entire structure that was existing as usable space, that all of that square footage could essentially be moved up 1 story. So that first floor will no longer, the ground floor would no longer count towards their square footage, but everything that had previously been enclosed within those walls or pilings would be allowed to be rebuilt as square footage for the next house. So that's not substantially increasing the size, the square footage of anything, but maybe providing additional square footage, because usually there was parking and storage below.
I just want to, something you said that I'm not going to be clear on. You said that if someone had a house with a couple of accessory dwelling units, regardless of what the condition of, what the legal status of those are, if the flood came and flooded those downstairs units, my impression was they could build them back as long as it was not considered substantial repairs.
It is, but I'm talking about when somebody wants to rebuild their house, because the vast majority of these were destroyed to an extent that they should not be built back.
Okay, so it's not about rebuilding.
No.
It's not about-
And I would never recommend that anybody build an apartment below flood elevation. That, just as a staff perspective, that's not a good idea. But when people are rebuilding, this is essentially what we're looking at. So.
Well, I was just going to say, could you elaborate a little bit more on the mayor's point? Because I think what you're saying, Mr. Mayor, and I agree with you. If somebody has a triplex or a duplex that was destroyed, and they're actually interested in building a single-family home, and we can allow them to build that a little bigger because they had a duplex or a triplex, I would think that would be good public policy because they're likely to have less cars, less traffic, less intensity to the island. Is that correct?
So you're saying you would encourage them to build back a single-family residence?
If they wanted to, I would think we would
yes,
encourage them. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
the density is the carrot, and that's what
I
people are.
wouldn't make them. I
Oh.
would just encourage. I would think we'd want to have some carrots out there for them.
Oh, I would tell you that the vast majority of people who have multiple units are struggling to find a way to build those units back, because that's where the true value is. Square footage matters, but the number of units matters. So the problem that we're running into is that people want to rebuild these triplexes. They can certainly get rid of them. They can say, no, I don't want to go through the trouble of doing that process. I would rather build a big single-family residence, and that's not a problem at all. That is allowed within our code. It's when they want to keep those units that they are running into this code issue. And we're trying to figure out a way that, if it makes sense, that we sort of resolve some of the issues within the code that are making it difficult to build these units back.
And that's what my point was. to almost exactly what you were just trying to say is, they can do that by right. They could build a 6,000 square foot, I'm just using that as a number, but as a single-family home, but currently they can't build a 6,000 square foot triplex.
Gotcha. Okay.
So, options to allow them to move all the square footage that existed within that unit essentially inside the walls. Not break it down into this was parking or this was storage or this was hallways, saying that, okay, this was a 2-story, this many square feet building. So we multiply it by that, that's how many square feet you have. You can figure out how you want to do it. You have up to how many units you had previously. If they had 3 units, they could build 3 units, 2 units, 1 unit. Well, if they're building 1 unit, they'll be fine. They're not going to be over density. They can do anything they want to do. But if they want something that's over density, then they would have to stay within that number of square feet.
So,
And
just kind of example to make sure I understand this. So if someone had a house upstairs, and let's say half of the downstairs was an accessory dwelling unit, and they want to rebuild, and let's say the total of the 2 areas was, let's say it's 1,200 feet in the top, 600 feet below. So that means they would get 1,800 square feet to divide up however they wanted. What you're kind of proposing
I'm
within those 2 units.
actually saying that they would be able to use that area below that was within the walls or the pilings of the structure. So even the parking area could count. So that would so if they had a little 400 square foot unit on the bottom, but they had 2 parking spaces, they can essentially have that same size house raised up.
So in your scenario, Bill, it would be 2,400 square
Yeah,
feet.
Yeah,
24.
yeah,
Above-
exactly.
Above base flood elevation.
Okay.
Another option would be to allow some percentage size, some increase in size, to make the house more livable, but not increase the number of units and not increase the number of bedrooms. And I don't know how we would determine that, so that would be the tricky part of that. What is a reasonable sized house or apartment? Another option would be to base it on the existing zoning district. The existing zoning district has setbacks. It has maximum building coverage. Some of them have floor area ratio. And, all the setbacks, all the other requirements, they would have to be able to build a house that met the zoning district standards, whatever that would be, and they couldn't increase the number of units or the number of bedrooms. So one of the arguments has been for not making them larger is the larger you make these units, for one, it makes them less affordable, but it also increases the chance that it's going to go from, maybe a workforce rental to a weekly rental. So we are interested in keeping this community a community of residents, as much as we can, within state law requirements. But by creating units that have 10 bedrooms, there are very few people who are moving into a 10-bedroom house.
Right.
So by keeping the number of bedrooms the same, but allowing the actual square footage of the units to increase, we're keeping the same size unit, 2-bedroom, 3-bath, whatever it would be, but giving them more square footage to work with. So, maybe in the 70s when this was built, a 300 square foot kitchen was fine, but now we're finding, well, you can't fit your appliances and your cabinets and all the
Wheelchairs.
things. So allowing them the additional square footage to build a house that actually fit into the fabric of the neighborhood. So meeting the same setbacks, same height requirements, all of the building requirements that you would have in that residential neighborhood, and potentially making it look as if it's that type of house. So if you're in a single-family residential neighborhood, but you have a duplex because you were allowed to have 2 density units, now you're allowed to make it bigger. You're allowed to increase the square footage. It needs to look like it fits in that single-family residential neighborhood, not like a triplex, not like, you're not making something that looks like it fits in a townhome community, but make it fit into the community based on the style, make it fit into the setbacks, and not increase the number of bedrooms. So you're not getting a massively larger input of people in the neighborhood.
So out of your 2 options, it sounds like you're leaning towards A and C. Which, in your professional opinion, makes the most sense? Because I like both of those. so with option C, would you say that if you could build the house like you could if it was a single-family home, but you can't, would you go as far as to say, but you can't, if you're keeping it a triplex, we'll just use a triplex, you can't come in and ask for variances to setbacks, to heights, to anything, you get back what you had, but it has to fit within the box that you're allowed to build?
So
Or-
I think you're allowed to ask for any variance you want. But they would have to have a very good reason. They have to
Right.
come before you and have a reason that now you're allowing them to have a non-conforming density. You've allowed them to have more square footage, and now they still can't fit it in their box. You know,
Right.
I think that that's going to be a component that you have to weigh in that. Is it appropriate to give them so much more additional square footage? Because that might have an impact on the neighborhood. That, you know, if you're saying, well, you're going to fit within the box that is a single-family residence in a single-family neighborhood. But if they're saying, but now we want to be 3 feet closer and 4 feet closer and 3 feet taller, that does have an impact on the neighborhood. Physically, you're making a difference there.
And with your option A, to Bill's scenario, say you have 1,200 square feet, so you're going to have 2,400 square feet that you could build back as a duplex or a triplex. They would still then, through that scenario, have the option to come in and ask for more. Similar to the cottage lots, you could build your 800 square feet. If you want to go up higher, you can come in and ask for it. Is that, or are you thinking this is what you get, and that's?
They can always ask for it. I mean, this is a section of the zoning ordinance. This is the land development regulations. They can ask for a variance from it, but I think that would have to be something that you would weigh into it. I mean, prior to the storm, people could come in with pre-disaster build back, and they were going through the CPD or RPD process, and they could ask for more than was currently allowed through that pre-disaster language. And, you know, there are several instances on the island where you can see that that's happened, that they've been allowed to build back the number of units that existed, and they were sometimes allowed substantially more square footage through an agreement, through conditions. So they have the option to do that. They could still go through an RPD process, or they could come in and ask for a variance.
So I know I got long-winded there. What, of those two options, which one do you think makes the most sense?
It really depends on how much you think there is an appetite for increase in square footage. So what you're going to find is a lot of these structures were very small. They were they had much bigger setbacks than the code requires, maybe the 25 in front and 20 in the rear, but a lot of times they came in on the sides quite a bit. They weren't as tall, so there is going to be a bulk difference when these are rebuilt, and if you allow them to rebuild to the current code setbacks and you don't allow them to increase the number of units and the number of rooms, what you're going to get is substantially what you're seeing everywhere else. Does that impact anybody? I don't know, because those people would have the right to build that structure with a single unit in it. So now they're building that structure with 2 or 3 or 4 units in it. Bulk-wise, it doesn't make a difference because that's the structure that could be built there anyway. The number of people-wise, it could make a difference. More people could stay in those units if they're larger. But theoretically, if you're keeping the same number of units, if you're keeping the same number of rooms, you're not going to see as much of a substantial increase. I mean, the places that you're going to see the increase are where you're going from potentially a 400 square foot, 1 bedroom, 1 bath to a 2,000 square foot, 1 bedroom, 1 bath. You have to know that something isn't going
right.
to stay the same
Right,
there.
right.
That may be the application and the permit we get, but something has changed in that use.
And again, and then I'll shut up and let everybody else kind of talk. But the I just want you to go reiterate that we're only talking about zoning districts that currently allow this use. We're not adding this use to a residential single-family area. So just for people that are listening that may not know, what zoning districts are we really talking about?
So this is essentially, every zoning district on the island has these non-conforming. We're not adding any additional uses. So, so in the RS zoning district, that's a single-family residential zoning district. That has mostly the lowest density. However, we do have units within those neighborhoods, not very many, but we have units with multiple multiple units within it. So it might look like a single-family residence on the outside, but have an additional apartment interior to it. What use-wise we're not doing is we're not changing that in the RS zoning district away from Estero Boulevard, you're still going to be in the one rental a month district. It's not going to increase the number of times that that unit can be rented or the shorter duration that it can be rented. So the uses are going to remain the same. You know, if it's a residential structure, it's still going to be a residential structure. If it had 2 dwelling units, it can continue to have 2 dwelling units. If it had 3, it can continue to have 3 if they go through this process. But it won't change, essentially the use of rental will remain the same. So in the places where it's 1 week rentals, it's going to stay 1 week rentals. In the places one a month rentals, it's going to stay 1 a month. So we're not making any changes to those type of regulations, and they're still a residential use.
Anyone else have questions for Sarah?
I'm so confused.
Okay, so let's, I know we got the ABC. Well, the first option would be leave things the way they are, which means people can build back what they had, including a 400 square foot unit if they had a 400 square foot unit. Then A was basically say we take whatever space in the ground floor and then they can decide how big the units are going to be, right? And then C was to say whatever square footage they're allowed for a single family residential, they can have and then do whatever they want as far as how they divide up the number of units they're allowed. And what was B?
But, but another component of that is not increasing the number of rooms and bathrooms. So it would not, you know, they may be able to make it larger, but they're not going to be increasing it from a 1 bedroom to a 5 bedroom.
I would hope so in this process that we're also record keeping about what was where and what's being built, so we don't do this again.
And that is very complicated. That has been a big part of this process because the Lee Property Appraiser's website, you know, sometimes information is available, sometimes information disappears on us. But all of that information should be available to us. And the applicant also has to provide it to us. If they can't provide us evidence that those units existed, that those bedrooms existed, that those bathrooms existed, we're not under any obligation to say, okay, you don't have any evidence you were a triplex, but go ahead and build a triplex. So they do have to provide that to us.
Yeah. And I would just say is, you know, my personal feeling is I like the variety of different housing options because I know there's a lot of people who would live in a 400 square foot unit to be on the beach, you know.
And to throw it out there, you know, one option that we had talked about a while back had to do with workforce housing and some of, you know, being able to keep all of the units and put one of those units into workforce housing or get additional square footage and put one of the units into workforce housing. You know, the question is, how do we manage that? And I think that's the biggest question that we have right now. How do we manage it? How do we implement it? But I don't think it's a bad concept, and I do agree with you. Those smaller units do make more reasonably priced units for people that work on the island.
John, you've been awful quiet down there.
I've been quiet all day for a reason, but I'm good, thank you.
Well, it sounds like option C probably gives people the most options without letting the cat out of the bag. And it seems like that's the most reasonable option. But I'm certainly open to my colleagues' comments as well.
Yeah, I think that's probably my favorite option. It allows them back what they had, but it allows that little bit of flexibility to be able to make it, I mean, yes, 400 square feet, people will live in it, but in a reality, having a bigger space opens up different people that could live in it. So,
I think the point that Sarah made, though, about, okay, so I assume with option C, we're saying same number of bedrooms, same number of bathrooms, same number of units. But then you get, are you creating a carrot that's going to make enforcement difficult, where, like you said, someone comes up with a 1,500 square foot, one bedroom, one bath place that, they're going to go through and, you're incentivizing them to go through and then subdivide that further and make it an enforcement problem.
well, I think the staff has a chance to review the plans. You'll be able to look through these plans and tell structurally how it's built, if that is their intent, I would think.
And if we find that that is becoming an issue, I mean, we've come to you before with issues where, we changed how building height is counted, and that was because people were putting extra units in their attics. So we were getting houses that were 4 stories tall, and we realized later on those were being retrofitted into units. So if we find that that becomes an issue, and hopefully it doesn't, hopefully people recognize that there's a reason it's being done this way, and if people don't need to build, if they have a 2-bedroom, 2-bath, and a 1-bedroom, 1-bath, and those are the units that were pre-existing in that house, hopefully they don't decide to build a monster house that just has so much square footage that you can't even reasonably use it with that number of bedrooms and bathrooms. Hopefully that they're building a house that makes the most sense for the number of units and bedrooms that they have.
Yeah, and I think that what we're trying to provide here is an option that people didn't have before.
Yes.
We're trying to give, and we know that there'll be people who try to take advantage of the system, and how do you deal with those people?
It's the 80-20 problem.
I think to steal Vice Mayor's, there's always, there are bad apples out there. How do you deal with that? Does it mean you don't ever get another short-term rental license for that property ever again? I don't know how you deal with that, but I don't think to create a policy just on what someone might do is very difficult.
Well, one thing to think about is the effect of doing a C means that you're going to get a lot of houses built setback to setback maximum length when they rebuild. Where some of the other options, they just don't have that kind of square footage. You're more likely to get a variety of different housing. So I understand what you're saying, but I think that really the option A gives people more of a proportional benefit. Where if someone had a really, a place with 400 square foot units, C gives them a huge bonus. Where, where someone like A just gives them, they'd be proportional. So whatever space is below, they get a little more. So I think, to me, A is more of a suitable compromise for me, because it's based on somewhat to what they had, but not exclusively to what they had.
And that was the reason I recommended that, because you are going to end up with a much closer to size that you had previously. So you're not going to see, they won't have the ability to make it that much bigger unless they decide to only do 1 story and just make it larger, or, like wider and not multiple stories. So I do agree that with that option, you do get something that's a lot closer to size and scale that you previously had.
Yeah, I think a hybrid, I agree with you, Bill, on that part. We don't want to give away a bunch, but we want them to have is there a hybrid way in there that you could do it? Because in using that scenario, the 1,200 square feet, 2,400 square feet for a triplex, you're still only dealing with 800 square foot units if you're going to do that. It's not by the time you put bathroom in there, it's not much more than an efficiency, really. It's, a little bit bigger than half the size again of a hotel room. So is there a way that we could do it to get somewhere in the middle between that and whatever you could fit in the box?
Well, and the other thing I'll say is that a lot of the multi-unit properties we've come across are on fairly small properties. So they're not on, like a giant beachside property where they're going to have a ton of space to expand out to. A lot of them are on, some of the middle streets, maybe smaller lots, and those very small units were built sort of lot line to lot line. you know, in a lot of instances, you know, with only 5-foot setbacks. So you're getting substantially the same thing, but built up.
Yeah, my concern
with
though
those.
is, you know, some of these that had the units on the ground, they had 2 units down below and 1 above, say, that on these smaller lots, trying to just even double what they had, and you have to go up in the air, you've got stairs, you've got ADA compliance, you got all these things that are gonna take up square footage, and is it 40% of the lot size? Is that what it is that you can build on if it's a single family? So
40% building
I mean,
coverage,
so
which,
you're not talking a huge number on some of these lots just
No.
because of that restriction alone. So that's why I think that C, because you're going to have add stairs, you're going to have ways to get to these 2 or 3 units, and that's a design choice. You have to figure out how you're going to design it to allow your guests to get there. That's up to you, but.
And I understand what you're saying, but I also say that, you know, I think 800 square feet, for a while, we owned a fourplex in Salt Lake City, and they were 800 square foot, 2-bedroom,
Oh, sure.
1-bath units. So, I mean, you know, they're pretty significant size, certainly compared to a 400 square foot place.
Yeah, I'm just, could you just explain A again? Because I'm coming in that direction, because I'm thinking about my 30-year-old son who's a bartender. He would be thrilled to death to have a 400 square foot place to live on this island. And I think there's a lot of, the younger set really doesn't need, they're not looking for size. They just want to be.
They want a bed and an
they want
efficiency
that's
kitchen
exactly
and a
right, yeah,
bathroom.
and they're happy with it. And
Yeah.
so that's our workforce. Doesn't help us, you know, get kids at the beach school necessarily, but it certainly would help with workforce. But
well, but you also have to think along those lines, will those units go to workforce, or will they still end up in the
Vacation
short-term
rental.
rental
it's
market?
a great question, yeah.
And, you know,
We all know
that's,
the answer to that.
and that's where
Yeah.
we get back to, if they're over density and they're a nonconformity, and we're allowing them to build back at the same density that they had, do we want to work with those property owners and find ways to put those into a workforce housing program? Because, like you said, that is what a lot of the workforce is going to want. You know, they're going to want an efficiency. But those units won't, while they may exist, they may not be available.
But that
And-
also puts a whole new level of structure and, what's the word I'm trying to think of, Frankie? But, you know, like, we're overseeing what they can do in their home.
Bureaucracy.
Control.
Well, and it would be a long-term agreement, like a 30-year agreement. And in a couple weeks, Marcus Goodson is going to come here from the Lee County Housing Authority and talk with you about some housing authority options. And at this point, we're not leaning really strong on how we can provide adequate workforce housing on the island, but this would be a way to do it. You know, there are a couple mechanisms that can be used to provide some workforce housing, because we are allowing a benefit. You know, we're allowing a nonconformity to remain. We're giving them something additional, some additional square footage, and in exchange for that, you know, sort of the exchange rate is you assist us by providing some workforce housing that's needed on the island. But, like you said, Karen, that is an additional layer of city or town staff or an organization that's going to be in charge of that, which there may be some options for that, but that's something we would have to investigate.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to make this policy decision on that. Too many unknowns
Yes.
to me
Right.
on that.
But I do think, you know, the part of it is if C is a big give, you know, then I think it makes sense to have some ask in that as well. You know, so if you're going to allow people potentially go from a very small unit to very large units, if there's a way we can put some condition there, and I realize if someone has the right for a short-term rental, you can't take that away. So if they have 2 short-term rental units, you can't take that away. But if it's in a residential area, maybe there's, I don't know, maybe we could come up with
And
some.
there may be an opportunity for impact fees in those instances, you know, where we had something that was probably a workforce, you know, range cost option and was probably not being rented out on a weekly or monthly basis. That's now taking a housing option off the market and putting it into a different market. So it might be possible to create a fee schedule for impact fees in instances where somebody has non-conforming density. They're allowed to put that non-conforming density back, but in exchange, there's an impact fee for that additional impact and the loss of housing to potentially workforce on the island. Because by increasing the square footage, you're increasing the cost and making it not a place that is now affordable.
So if a lot was 75 by 100, let's
Okay.
say, they could build 40% of that square footage, right? So 3,000 square foot house is essentially what they could build. I'm just trying to put the math to some of these lots. They're not very big lots. You know, what's the max they could build if it was a single family
Well,
home anyway?
that's the footprint, right, not the house size.
Yes, so that's a footprint, right? Or is it the total buildable area is 40%?
Oh, it's the building coverage is 40%, so it's everything within the roof line, essentially.
So if it's 3 stories, so it'd be 3,000, in this case, it would be a 3,000 square foot house, or 3,000 square feet per floor.
I don't do math, but what I can tell you is like the size of the lot, 40% of that can have a roof over it. So
Yes,
if
so that
that's
means it's-
multiple
Okay, so it
levels.
could be multiple levels. That's what I was trying to get at.
3,000
Okay.
square
Yeah,
feet, but
floor
it could be
area-
1,000 square
It could be
foot.
6,000 square feet. if
Floor
it was
area
3
ratio
stories.
is the multiplier of
Oh.
that building coverage.
And I think that's what Bill was trying to say, is if you go with option C, you could have someone come and say, I want 3 2,000 square foot, 1-bedroom units. And that's, we all know that's not the case, but.
Exactly.
So if we go with option A, they still have a path that they could come through if they wanted to get more square footage than the 2,400 square foot scenario that Bill's referring to. They just have to go through the process to do it, but they could do it if they wanted to.
Yes.
I'm okay with that.
But could you, if you're talking about hybrids, could you do the option A, which is basically that inside the piling, so it just moves up a level, correct? But then could you say the maximum that you could have were the number of beds and number of baths that you had before?
Yeah, I think that would,
Yeah, that would be the intent of it.
That's the intent of that then, okay.
but that would have to be spelled out in the code, that you're
Right.
getting back your 3 units, but they have to stay, if they were 1 bedroom, 1 bath, they have to stay 1 bedroom, 1 bath.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
And
in a
again,
lot
this
of
is-
instances.
And again, this is providing something that they couldn't do before this policy change.
Yes. And, you know, I also want to add, this would give a pretty decent substantial square footage to units that if a structure didn't have a unit on the first floor and was all parking below, that's still within the walls. So that gives them that additional square footage. If you felt like that was appropriate, that was my intent, was anything that was on that ground floor, which was previously considered usable and is now, has to be moved up.
I think it's a very well thought out compromise.
Okay.
Just something that
Sounds good.
Yep. As far as usage, and we talked a lot about density. I mean, what's the difference between someone who has a house with an accessory dwelling unit or someone who has a duplex? Because I know, like, the first house we bought on the island had a legal, non-conforming apartment downstairs that they went in front of town. They showed them that this adorable little paraplegic woman, someone's grandmother, was living in there when the town was incorporated, but you couldn't have a separate address, couldn't have, you know, the post office wouldn't consider it a duplex. Are there other restrictions with ADUs that you don't get with a duplex?
I don't know that I could speak to that, how that is. I know that some of the, what we would consider accessory dwelling units or apartments, some of them have had separate water meters, some of them have had separate addresses, some of them have had separate like total utilities. Others haven't. So I'm not clear on how the different utilities and the post office, how they view it. So we would have to rely on them for some of that information. I couldn't tell you what that was. And if you look within the code, there's, you know, very specific language about what counts as an accessory dwelling unit and what doesn't. And I think that some of that may have to just be abandoned because it is no longer applicable, and that isn't the criteria we're necessarily using, and it needs to be based on going forward. This is the density that we're at, rather than having this sort of niche language that makes it hard to understand what fits and what doesn't.
Yeah. Because I remember being very complicated, and it was a thing like, the unit on the bottom, it could be owner occupied, but if the owner wasn't occupying the top, they couldn't rent the bottom. It was just a very complicated thing. It seemed like it reduced the value, not only the value, but the value to the town of having that small.
And there's no way for the town to enforce that either. We could say it has to be homesteaded, the unit has to be homesteaded, but there's no way to ensure that the people will actually be living there. They can homestead a property without actually being in that property. So we don't have a good way to ensure that that would happen, and I don't think that that language necessarily makes sense to remain in there, just because it makes it overly complicated to implement and impossible for the town to really verify.
Okay. So it sounds like we're leaning towards option A. Is Counselor King?
Yes.
So just for clarification, so option A, we're talking about everything that was previously usable space within the walls of the structure, ground floor and above, can now be usable above the base flood elevation, enclosed as rooms, however they want to do it, not increasing the number of bedrooms, number of bathrooms, and number of units.
Correct.
Okay.
Would it be easier instead of, to use the word footprint, the footprint of the building itself, as opposed to, the outside walls? The footprint of the foundation or the footprint of the building, however, that's more clear for the architect, designer, people of the world out there?
That would work.
Right.
One thing I do want to throw out there is, do we want to allow some increase for restrooms? There are instances where, it was a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom, and now if you have a lot of extra square footage, you might want an additional bathroom.
I'm not opposed to that. I think that you got to use some common sense with that.
Okay, so keeping the same number of bedrooms, and no
The
more.
bathrooms can't exceed the bedrooms, I guess.
Okay.
You know?
Well, that's
Yep.
a good way to put it.
I like that.
Mr. Builder here.
Yes.
Any other questions for Sarah?
Why don't you do math?
It's a life philosophy.
I like it.
All right, thank
No,
you,
she'd
Sarah.
rather work on all the detailed contracts and zoning and everything. I'll do math instead.
Yeah, there you go.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Sarah. Agenda management. Is there anyone that would like to discuss, add, adjust?
One thing I'd like to add is, what I'd like to is if we have any other proposals from people that we've heard about that would kind of like fiber, like the University of Florida, if we can just put it on the agenda where we look at all those different options and just come up with a path to move forward.
Would that be what the Urban Land Institute is on here, or?
Yes, that's what I was
another-
going to mention. Glad Councilor Beach brought it up. I've had conversations with them, and we could set up another M&P meeting that they can come and present. One's free, one's there's a charge. So we can.
I mean, because I know there's someone else emailed me another similar group, and I just think that, and I know that the town, the mayor has talked about the county, or is that the same thing as the Urban Land Institute?
I think ULI was in conjunction with the county, and basically focusing though on Old San Carlos, that corridor right through there though. That's what that one was, my understanding.
Yeah, I just like to.
and there. That's why I asked the question about duplication of benefits. You know, seemed like they were more focused on not so much zoning and things like that Sarah and staff are already working on. They were more of a global, you tell us what you want the island to look like, and we could show you pictures of this is what it could look like based on talking to the community and talking to the council members and staff. And here's a picture. Like it, you don't. You go back to the drawing board, you redo it. So it was more of a, and maybe they need to come in so everybody can kind of hear what they had to say, because theirs was a little bit of a different tact than what they were just talking about, but essentially the end goal was the same. So it might be, and they have worked with the county before in the past, so it can't hurt to listen to them if we can get them to come in and.
Yeah, I think maybe as soon as possible, as soon as we can get them on an M&P, that would be.
Okay. Anything else?
And then I just say, I'd like to see, soon after that, maybe we'll put it out that if anybody else has any ideas or been talking to somebody, to come forward so we can just get all our choices on the table and then make a decision. And like you said, it may be a hybrid thing.
Yep. Counselor Woodson?
Well, does that also combine then, if you're looking at the urban land thing, the downtown district analysis? Is that kind of one and the same, or not?
I would think that, to me, they all seem like they're.
They're
I think,
kind
I
of
think so.
kind of
Yeah.
combine those.
Yes.
And then I was just looking at the agenda here for 1016
Yeah.
with a and I understand second readings and all that, but the LDC comp plan updates, where does that fit in with our joint meeting for next Tuesday? Is that something that should be part of that, or how does that work?
I had just leaned over to Amy and said, I don't know that makes sense on that date.
Correct.
With the joint meeting the week before, I
Right.
think that's going to be entirely too soon. So let's not plan on that as a date for the Corradino group to come.
Because I'm thinking that's a long conversation and presentation, and we need to have the other meeting.
Yeah, so we need to have
Correct.
that joint meeting, and then we need to make any updates that are necessary before we try to do anything like that.
So that one will move to whatever next date you decide is the right one. Okay.
Yeah, and I understand, certainly from the length of the meeting, but I would certainly, I'd like to follow up the joint meeting with a conversation just within the council too, because that's another thing I'd just like to see move along.
Well, I agree with that too, Bill, but I'm just saying, I don't think there's enough time based on having that joint meeting and whatever we decide there. I don't think there's enough time for staff to even make.
To make adjustments based
Right,
on what the
right.
input from the meeting.
Well,
joint meeting.
I asked Becky this specifically to try to address, I think, what you're alluding at. Because it is a properly noticed meeting, the council could technically take a vote at that meeting on certain aspects if they needed to or wanted to. So if there's something that comes out of that joint meeting that we
Yes.
feel is important to make a decision on that day to allow staff to get working on it, we certainly are within our legal right to be able to do that.
Yes.
So then part of what I'm wondering is, and I don't know, is that presentation by Corradino, would that be part of our joint meeting? Or could it be part of our joint meeting, or no?
No, Corradino won't be at
They won't be.
That won't be at the joint meeting.
Okay.
It will be us going through some specific questions that we need to have covered so
Okay.
that we can provide feedback to Corradino. This is a way for us to just make sure we're sorting through the bigger issues. And I want to note that the agenda date for us to get things onto the 16th is like 2 weeks before that. So there's no way we'd have any of the responses from the joint meeting that we could put on to the agenda for the 16th.
So maybe realistically 11/2? The 11/2 meeting, council meeting?
Or it's at 11:06.
Potentially.
Or 11/6, whatever.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, 11/6 meeting?
Potentially. We'll have to see how much comes out of that meeting and have, so staff, after meeting with, having the joint session, we're going to put together our thoughts, and Corradino's also going to be watching the meeting, I'm sure. We'll have a meeting with them to figure out a timeline of when we can have updates.
So now, and so you say you need 2 weeks, so that means that the 16th, we can take stuff off of there, we're not going to add anything more to the.
Anything else?
And since
Okay.
publication, the last three, the closeout utility projects, the Tier 1 side streets and the SRF loans, they've been moved back to the 6th by utilities staff.
Okay. So those three have been moved.
Yep.
So our long meeting got
It's
shorter.
cut in half.
Anything else, Counselor Woodson?
No, I'm good.
So I think you just covered what I was gonna, I had, there's a lot of talk, obviously, Andy and Frankie out there about the stormwater and the flooding in Bahia Villa and downtown, and I think it would be, whether it's at a meeting or whether it's at an M&P, have staff in here with our new engineer and with Steve and go through because I think a lot of people have forgotten that, there's a tier 1 and the whole, what the plan was before the storm hit. I think a reminder of how we got there, what has happened since the storm that has set that back, and what our plans are to expeditiously as possible fix the flooding issues that we're having on the street. So I think having I don't know if that's what these 3 things were going to be on the agenda, but I think to have the staff in here to be able to just walk us through what was in place before the storm, the plan, what was damaged, and what the plan is to fix the worst offenders, I guess is not the best word to use, but going forward, I think would help our residents a lot.
That's probably a good meeting, the 16th, to have staff do that, and the 16th, before we get into some of that, the next meeting. We'll get staff.
If they
make them
think they have
available.
enough time to just kind of.
I think that would be good.
Yeah, and I think too, I think that's a great idea, Mr. Mayor, and I think too, if staff could, as best as you can, give people a sense as to what the timeline is for each street, which ones come first, which ones are prioritized based upon, the significant issues that they face, so they have an expectation. We're still seeing pictures of Bahia Villa. You can't walk through it's 4 days after the rain, they can't even walk through there yet. And I know there's a lot going on, but I'm just, so people have an expectation as to when maybe there's a short-term fix and maybe there's a long-term fix, but so they can see some kind of a timeline, so at least their expectations can be set.
To answer that, Mr. Vice Mayor, we already have a solution in place for Bahia Villa that'll be happening in the next few days.
Could you speak up on that? Because I think a lot of people are interested in that.
Yeah.
It's good news.
Yes, our town engineer and our utilities manager have already come up with a short-term solution, which we feel will alleviate some of the issue of Bahia Villa, to at least get us to the opening of Tier 1. The Bahia Villa is the very first street that will be hit when Tier 1 goes into effect. So that is going to be an area that's going to be directly impacted on a positive note once we start construction.
That's great news. And is that a short-term solution that you can share, or you're still working through the technicalities?
No, basically, they've come up with a solution of, for all intents and purposes, putting a French drain system across the street. That's the best way to describe it. It's a simple corrugated pipe sunk in gravel below grade to absorb all that water and drain it off into the canal.
Excellent. Thank you. Appreciate that update.
Yep.
Similar to like a drain tile in the farm fields back in, where are you from this week? Wisconsin, Chicago?
Idaho this week.
French, never heard of a French drain, but that's, yeah.
So how does that differ in functionality from a swale?
A swale is basically just a cut into the land. So you're going with grade from one point to another, like on a surveyor's mark. So you're going from a high point to a low point. The swale actually moves the water along that avenue, free flowing. Sometimes swales can be backed up on the back end if the height of where you intended to go isn't equal to where the water is sitting currently. Swales work great if the whole water system is working great. We don't have that on this island after Ian, and definitely after some of these areas were hit again from Idalia from the beach flooding that occurred. So the French drain that we're proposing for this location is actually sunk below street level. The water seeps into this system and is actually taken out exactly like drain tile. And it will work in that function until Tier 1 can come along and alleviate for good in those areas.
And I assume, is this going to be kind of similar to what they put underneath the Estero Boulevard, where there'll be porous rock around it?
That is correct. That is similar to what we're proposing as well. Yeah.
Okay, Vice Mayor Adderall?
Well, I was going to comment on what you just suggested, Mr. Mayor, but since you covered that well, I was just going to ask Sarah, will we have some kind of an agenda for this joint meeting with the LPA? In other words, there were some interesting revelations at the end of the last LPA meeting. I believe you or Jason said something to the effect that there's nothing in the comp plan that limits height, and there was lots of shock and awe in the audience. And I think, and then our town attorney mentioned the ramifications of Senate Bill 250. There was, again, lots of shock and awe. I guess before we're asked to go around the room, which I thought was a great thing when everybody said definitively where you stand, I think we need to make sure that our premise is something we could all agree on. Because it seems like the premise is evolving or changing, or it's so flexible that no one really knows what the comp plan does control and what it doesn't control, and what the LDC does and what it doesn't, and what you get through a CPD. I've heard so many different versions and interpretations over the last year. It's really difficult. I just want to make sure, I don't mind what the terms are. I just think we need to set the terms so we all know what we're talking about, A. And B, it would be great to see a future land use map. I used to have one when I was on the LPA, but I can't find it post-Hurricane Ian. And I don't know where we get those, and can we get those before the meeting and make sure the public has those? So I know they're hard to reproduce, but.
Our current one is on the website.
It is?
And yes.
Okay.
And the proposed one, we got some changes made to it yesterday. I uploaded it into the agenda for that meeting, which has not yet been published. All of you will get a copy of that. We're also printing them off. We're making the new map into 3 sections on 24 by 36 so that they're very big and visible, so you can see all the lots within the different future land use districts. So yes, that will be made available to you. We just had some last minute tweaks that we saw there were issues with mistakes in the map.
And do you think you'll be able to maybe set the table before we have the discussion as to what the comp plan does and what it doesn't do, and what the LDC does do and what it doesn't do, just so we all are on the same page?
Yes.
I don't mind what those terms are. I just think we all need to be working from the same playbook here
Yes.
as we have our conversation.
Yes, we can certainly do that. We will set it up. So the plan is to first start explaining what the comprehensive plan is. Next, we're going to move on to, this is what we've heard you've already decided you want. Is that still what you want? Then we're going to move on to specific questions that we need to address in order to update the comprehensive plan. These are questions that staff has come up with, working in concert with the consultant to ensure that we can answer all the all the required questions and make all the updates that are necessary to get in front of you a comprehensive plan that you're all comfortable with. And I would encourage you to not listen to what everyone is saying. Everyone doesn't know what a comprehensive plan is, but if you have questions, please ask staff. We can answer all of your questions, and we can hopefully allay some of your fears that are being brought up, that some of them don't need to be fears. They just are not real issues. But there is, the Coconut Telegraph is going crazy lately, and we're hearing about it, and we can answer any questions you have. There's nothing to be worried about. Everything is moving along very orderly. We're not proposing anything that's just going to blow your mind or scare anybody, in our opinion.
Well, I appreciate that. And speaking of the Coconut Telegraph, and I'm going to violate something I challenged Councilor Veach the other day on, because it's not an agenda issue, but I did hear on the Coconut Telegraph, and since Steve is sitting here, there seems to be another rumor flourishing that because contractors have to register with the town, there's an inference by some that that's somehow an endorsement by the town. I know that's not the case, but Steve, if you could just give us 30 seconds as to why contractors register with the town of Fort Myers Beach, what the purpose of that is, and that if that is or is not an endorsement, which I don't believe it is.
Steve Poposky, town engineer. It's not an endorsement. It's just each jurisdiction, registers its contractors, so we kind of know who's associated with a permit. We want to make sure that they have the proper licensing and insurance coverage, workers' comp, and so forth, liability. So it's not, anyone can, as long as they're properly state licensed, they will become registered with the town, and then it's more of informational from our point, so we can identify who's working.
So the contractor, if they're state licensed and registered, they still need to do that with the town as well, and that's something that they have to fill out on the town's website?
They essentially just send us the proof of their licensure and insurance to us, and that's the registration process. We add it into our permitting system, and that way, if DBPR ever asks us, who is this contractor working in this town, we can answer that question.
And so when people see that on our website, that's anyone who's involved in requesting a permit to do work on Fort Myers Beach, they have to register with the town.
Correct.
But it absolutely is no form of endorsement from the town itself.
No, the state is responsible for all licensure.
Yep, I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you, Steve.
Mhm.
Yep, that's all I've got, Mr. Mayor.
I have one question for Jim. So on this thing, it says Beach School and it has your initials behind it. Is that something right now that we should be talking about and moving up? Because evidently the kids will be coming back into school in November. And to start this whole philosophy of, with the chamber and everything, and helping recruit or giving knowledge of the beach school and all kinds of materials for companies that are recruiting to bring people on, like Margaritaville right now, and as season gears up, and
That's a great question. I'm certainly open to that. I think our challenge is that we don't have the numbers yet and the data from the school. I ran into this superintendent at the Day of Remembrance, and I encouraged him. The ad hoc or the interlocal agreement that we signed with the Lee County School District requires that the ad hoc committee, and it's constituted in the interlocal agreement as to what the makeup of that ad hoc committee is. We are supposed to be meeting, and we've not had a meeting. So I challenged the superintendent to initiate that meeting, encouraged him to have it at the school itself. He said we couldn't do that because of all kinds of OSHA and safety requirements. We can't have it at the school, but I encouraged him to have it on the island. And I think once we have that first ad hoc committee meeting, we'll have a better sense as to what the data is. I think some of the other challenges that we're facing, and I don't think they're challenges, I think they're opportunities, is that, and I don't want to start any kind of rumors or anything, but there's been some discussion behind the scenes that the school itself has made significant reductions and economies in their budget. They've made they've combined some grades, they've reduced administrative staff, and the numbers in terms of their cost per student are down demonstrably in potential compliance with the interlocal agreement. We've yet to see those numbers yet because they haven't really gotten back on the island yet, but we could have a dynamic where we meet the terms of the interlocal agreement before we even start. Obviously, we still want to grow our school, and we still want to do all the things that continue to allow that school to prosper, and I support having this on the M&P. But I just think there's a number of variables going on right now, and of course we saw that the Lee County school system got $51 million for post-Ian disaster assistance from the state. I'm hoping, given the fact that our school was at the tip of the spear once again, as the island was, that maybe the Lee County School District might consider some of that $51 million coming to help Fort Myers Beach and continuing to expand some of the assets on that property. I'm happy to have that on the M&P. I just don't know if it's ripe yet because there's so many variables still out there. But happy to continue. I think any publicity we can give, not only just to the business community and to the chamber, but I think our realtors on the island are tremendous ambassadors as they introduce families to our island, and they can talk about the school and all the various advantages and so forth. So I just think any conversation is good. I'm just not sure we have anything substantial at this point, given the fact that there's so many variables in play. But happy to have it. I think anytime we have it on the agenda, it's a good thing.
no, and that's great. I just didn't want to lose sight of it. I know
Yep.
there's just a lot of conversation about the school opening and the kids coming back and all that, and, but if we don't have the numbers yet, but maybe just encourage the school district to get going on that meeting.
Yes, again, as the superintendent was at the ceremony, taking credit for the rebuilding of the school, which I thought was somewhat ironic, but happy that he was there. I challenged him to have this ad hoc committee meet as soon as possible so we can have those conversations, because that partnership is important, and that certainly getting the word out to our businesses and employers and just the chamber, the realtors, et cetera, is very important to growing that base of kids for the school. And so, but your point is well taken.
Councilor King?
I think just along those lines of what Jim spoke about, It just popped in my mind, and I'm sure, hopefully, maybe, I don't know, if Jenny or who would work on it, but that first day that we're all there to welcome them back to school on the island. So I think that would be exciting, and I've seen it done in other places before for just, just the normal schools starting. So I would like to see something like that happen if possible.
And maybe when the after-school program starts in the New Bay Oaks, we can have a little pickup game. I'm picking you for my basketball team.
I wouldn't go with the old fat man anymore.
Is there anything else?
No, thank you.
All right. If there's nothing else, a motion to adjourn?
Well, before we do that, because I was just looking at this list too. Jim, where are we with this Veterans Tribute that we've been talking about now for what, 3 years?
I think at least 3 years. Probably before we were even elected, Councilor Veach, there was significant conversations by previous councils. We are, and to Frankie's credit, he's more than happy to help us facilitate this. We are currently working with one of our residents who has a relationship with the artist who did the lettering for the Vietnam Memorial, to consult with them to figure out what kind of a stone we'll need. Frankie has done sort of the logistical research in terms of stones and placement, and we need to then contract with the artist so we can then get the work done and figure out a way to get the stone then back to the island and design. But I think it's all in flux. There was no way we could do it by the time of the remembrance ceremony. Some have asked me, will we have it done by Veterans Day? And a lot of it just depends on what the artist has, what his availability is in terms of what other projects he's working on. So it is still absolutely in process. I think the town manager and our director of operations have kindly found funding for it, so we don't have to worry about that piece of the puzzle. And so as soon as we know a little bit more, I'll be happy to share that. But it's a little bit in flux because we're sort of working on that agreement with the artist, and then the timing will flow from that. And again, for those who may not know, the monument itself then will be placed, there's already a place reserved for it at Bayside Park, and it will involve 2 quotes, one from former President Kennedy and one from former President Reagan, and both quotes are quotes that honor our veterans, and so a nice bipartisan tribute to those who have served.
I look forward to seeing it. Veterans Day would be great, but I'm not sure.
That's probably going to be tough.
It's really tight, yeah.
Maybe Memorial Day. Yeah.
If I may, I think I'd mentioned it to the Vice Mayor, it might be something to consider renaming the park to Bayside Veterans Memorial Park, something for you to consider, just a fitting tribute, I think.
Very interesting idea.
And we could do that in conjunction with Veterans Day. That's an easy one.
I'd like to have that monument if we're going to rename it. I'd love to have the timing be together. But
Okay. Anything else? John?
Move to adjourn.
I'll second. Any other discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye. Aye. Everybody else?
Aye.
John?